Is my microphone... Okay. All right. So let's get this on the road here. Okay, let's get this figured out. I'm not going to waste your time, so I'm going to start off with the thesis. Persona 4 has a fascinating and somewhat under-discussed white elephant: television. The game examines television as a media machine. Still, there's something else at stake. Television helps us rethink media devices, not as enclosed objects, but as points of relation to a structure, with histories and cultural flows, up to and including how these devices, based on their technicity, generate intellectual and aesthetic questions that can go in exciting directions. And this video is going to look at two of them in a lot of different ways. It's also kind of messy, so it's probably best to treat this as a podcast. So let's go. I got a dark secret. To the people who watch my content, they may have already noticed something that crops up now and then. And the people who don't, well, let's get off on the right foot.
Okay. Yeah, she gets reincarnated and turned into a race car.
The hat. It crops up in a lot of random videos. It's Junpei's hat from Persona 3. And so you might look at it and think, wow, you're a Persona fan. Upon which I say, well, yeah, of course. I mean, I have the hat. Like, what do you think I have this for? Irony? Persona 3 is really interesting. It concerns the strange ephemeral tower, which has emerged out of this Ozymandian human experiment, sprinkled with a healthy dosing of sometimes straightforward and other times cryptic Jungian psychoanalysis. But the video isn't about Persona 3. Persona 4 is really interesting. It's a really fascinating examination of space and body in a lot of ways. Now, let's lay down some ground rules here. People are going to think, oh, you're probably not a real Persona fan. You know, you play 4, that's a casual game. Which is, I guess it's kind of true, but I also clocked in a few hundred hours on this thing, playing it on the original PS2, and then buying it to play it on the PlayStation Vita. And then, I bought it again to play it on Steam and then on Game Pass. So I want to stress a pretty notable element. Joke, Maelstrom aside, I have no idea what that intro was. Let's talk about the thing in question. Persona 4 is a fascinating piece of work because of how it operates. The game envisions television as a technical and aesthetic object. I'm going to get into what those mean later, probably at this timestamp, but until then, it will be a little bit of a harangue. But first, we've got to stop off at the best part. Let's start off with the lore dump. For the 7 people who don't know Persona 4, let's talk about what it is first. Now, a lot of people don't like plot dumps, and a lot of people love plot dumps. I'm trying to get both audiences, so I've quarantined this video section to these moments. If you hate seeing some rando explain the lore of Persona 4, but realistically you probably don't, the numbers are against you, just skip to the next section. I'm gonna have it all timestamped. So what's Persona 4? Indie darling Persona 4 is a turn-based dungeon crawler / anime high school simulator where you play as city-based interloper Yu Narukami, or Seto Soji, or Charlie Tanoku if you're a boomer.
Charlie!
Narukami, who's there because his parents are supposedly away, is functionally spirited away to his uncle Ryotaro Dojima and his daughter, your cousin, Nanako.
Ow!
After shaking hands with the mysterious gas station attendant, he gets a headache, which effectively sets up the beginning of the mystery, but also doubles down as an accurate rendition of what happens when a city boy gets slammed into rural Japan.
Are you okay?
They can't handle pollen. Concurrently, Inaba has another problem. They find a woman's body hanging upside down from the telephone poles. Nobody knows what's happening. Unfortunately, she's not going to be the last. Meanwhile, at the ranch, Narukami finds out about the Midnight Channel, a paranormal late-night television program. They say if you look into a turned-off TV after a rainy night, you'll see the silhouette of your soulmate. What begins as a stock rumor becomes a half-truth. Someone does show up on the Midnight Channel. But whom? Along the way, he befriends Yosuke, the son of general manager of Junes, which is effectively choking out all the local businesses. It's Aeon. During their investigation, they discover that you can enter the TVs. Doing so puts them in a strange other world. Here, they meet Teddy, the mascot character that doubles as the navigator. but Teddy's a very good navigator.
At this rate, it might end up getting bare naked.
Narukami unlocks his persona just in time for Yosuke to unlock his. Part of what makes the persona is that most people need to face their shadow forms, as a means of dealing with what seems to be deeply seated anxieties. If they properly face their shadows, it crystallizes into personas. Narukami doesn't have to face his, and it makes sense. He's from the city, he's got no soul. But it turns out somebody's been throwing people into the TV world, and when they see their shadows, when they face them, if they find themselves incapable of dealing with it, they die. Their bodies show up in the real world after the fog dissipates. The game's overall plot then runs into these two dominant threads. On one hand, Narukami and Yosuke build a sizable group of allies known as the Investigation Team, or Squad, which consists of a bunch of fellow high schoolers who were would-be victims of this mysterious assailant. On the other hand, he's also a high schooler in a Japanese video game, so he has to do Japanese high school shit, so that the secondary plot is kind of more of an emergent narrative. Players read books, take tests, and talk to people. Over the year, you play two roles, the high schooler and the investigator. So let's get into spoilers. Adachi turns out to have been the culprit. Hailing from the Dennis Rader school of serial killers, Adachi turns out to have been the one dumping people into the TVs and effectively leaving them to their devices. The investigation team defeats him, and then they defeat a giant Technicolor eye, and then if you choose to pursue the good ending, you beat the real villain, the gas station attendant. Persona 4 was remastered into Persona 4 Golden for the PS Vita, and then Windows, and then pretty much every console known to man, which realistically forms the bulk of the analysis of this video because nobody is that attached to the original PS2 Persona 4.
Aha! Is this our chance?
Okay, so Wikipedia-style plot summary over. Let's talk about how Persona plays on a technical level. Persona 4 revolves around an overarching core gameplay loop which has primarily been perfected by its predecessor, Persona 3, and it does it real well. This is tied into how it thinks its overworlds. On one hand, you have the Inaba world where you play as a goofy high school student where you grind stats and get money, and all that helps you perform in the other world, the shadow world of the TV. In Inaba, you're directed through turns, which approximate time. Things take up time, and thus it becomes a resource to manage. Here, what you want to do on any given day can be heavily determined by how far or close you are to a critical event. In the TV world, you have summons known as personas, which can cast spells and have attributes that form the core encounter space of the battles. As you level up, you have access to an increasing number of potential personas through a process known as fusion. With fusion, you gain a rising number of possible personas, and because personas always level up much more slowly than the character, you don't realistically level up your personas through Pokemon-style encounter leveling, but through event leveling. The game is kinda interesting in that as you get stronger, the enemies just get easier. So some personas out there can start tanking and nullifying entire branches of damage. And once you realistically fuse the hell beast that is Yoshitsune and learn Hasutobi, the combat becomes a non-factor. So how do you level up efficiently? Well, you increase the amount of additional XP through fusions by interactions with others in the Inaba world space, through social links. Social links are incremental. You unlock the next stages as you gain affinity with characters. Each social link is represented by a tarot. So, if you have a persona in your corresponding roster to that tarot, you gain an additional affinity. As stages increase, you provide more XP when fusing personas respective to their social links. So here's the fundamental operative logic of the gameplay. Everything funnels into that cycle. You get stronger personas by fusing them, which requires you to nurture social links. Social links are maximized by carrying personas of corresponding types at any given moment. Everything you do in Inaba funnels down to social links. Your abilities allow you to unlock new options, help you gain affinity, and unlock new social link routes. As you unlock more social links, you can unlock stronger personas with more skill loadouts much more quickly. So you need to grind with top level skills less and less the more social links you've nurtured. This helps because as dungeons get more difficult, you are incentivized to have much stronger personas than keeping the ones you have from the beginning. So in a lot of ways, despite looking a lot like Pokemon plus Satan, Persona's team logic is very different. In Pokemon, you're incentivized to keep your Pokemon as long as possible since you have a lot more control over how their values granularly grow based on how you nurture them. This is even more important considering that a lot of Pokemon, especially since the 3rd gen, have been increasingly non-combative. Contests, happiness checks, behaviors, and natures, there is a mechanical argument to keep them with you as long as possible. Persona is different in that what you keep on your teams frequently gets funneled out until you hit the game's late stages. Now, in Golden, the game implements a card minigame that dramatically reduces the amount of labor required, but the core operation is the same: get stronger personas. So what about its gameplay? Persona 4 is one of those games that naturally engenders discussion because of what it's concerned with. There are a lot of reasons why it's so popular, not including that it was a massive financial success and was constantly pushed by Atlus through consistently iterative remakes and spin-offs, a process that we're kind of seeing with Persona 5, but on a narrative level, I think it's partly because of how intimate it keeps a lot of its storytelling. See, Persona 3 carries some of the older Shin Megami Tensei scale in that it inherited from its predecessors, in that the scope expands into this broader science fiction dimension, the unveiling of these larger conspiratorial elements which reconciles with the fate of the world. Persona 4 is different in that the scale is smaller and subsequently its plot feels a lot more intimate. Inaba is the entire topos of the dilemma. You go elsewhere, but those places aren't realistically at risk the same way Inaba is. Even in the worst situation, we aren't dealing with the scale of Persona 3's consequences. What's at stake feels closer, and a lot of its characters reflect that intimacy. Persona 4 is focused on this idea of self-improvement and how that self-improvement occurs, primarily through how its characters engage with interpolation. Now, interpolation refers to a hailing, where if the subject responds to the call, they become involved in the subjectivating process. The famous example is, if a cop says, "Hey, you," there's a whole set of unspoken processes that shape the rest of the interactions. If you respond to the cop, you've responded to the figurehead of a law. Suppose you do respond to the cop, you are concerned with what the cop thinks you are. The public space shapes the subject in the process of the hail. But what if you don't, right? Like, what if you continue on your way? You might worry about what happens if you don't. And then you worry, well, maybe I should have responded to the cop. The idea that you should have, even if you aren't doing anything that would warrant you stopping, is how a public space shapes individuals to become subjects. Interpolation gives insight on how values and relations reproduce. It demonstrates how subjects think of themselves publicly in the sense that they behave with regards to institutional categories. A corollary is that if the hail misfires, if interpolation fails to click the way it does, it still kind of works in that it makes you a subject anyways, because oftentimes the subject sees something wrong with them. They internalize structures of identity that define them. And Persona 4 is fascinating because it has a heavy emphasis on interpolation. How someone becomes a subject or grapples with moments where who they are as subjects don't play well with what public spaces expect of them. Now, this is manifested through, I think, inheritance, both in these broad structural things, but also in very intimate relations. At the heart of much of Persona's character arcs is handling expectations muted upon them. It's why questions about gender roles and sexuality crop up a lot in discussions about Persona 4, and to a lesser extent, questions about external pressure. The most extreme examples are Kanji and Naoto, the perpetual discourse characters, who both represent that interlock between gender and assumptions that come with it. Their concerns are both structural and intimate. See, Kanji is this thuggish rough rider who demonstrates a keen soft spot for what are things deemed effeminate.
Even instant ramen takes 5 minutes to make.
And Naoto is a detective who attempts to take on the trappings of male-dominated police system to be taken more seriously, and in doing so, generates deep-seated uncertainties about their gender.
Please don't give people bizarre nicknames you make up on the spot.
In other words, they're hailed in relation to gender performances, what girls and boys should do or should act, but they're also what are called always already subjects, in that there's no genesis point that makes them a subject, but they've always been subject, and it's really hard to disentangle that. Disentangle? Because for Kanji and Naoto, they're inheritors of family businesses, and that prestige comes in with expectations on how they should behave. Kanji, as he notes, will likely inherit Tatsumi Textiles due to concerns about his mother's health, but is informed by a misinterpretation of his father's advice.
But that wasn't it. That ain't what Dad meant.
Which manifested into toxic masculinity. And Naoto, as part of the Shirogane clan of detectives, finds her ability to express her gender is fuzzied by what she believes constitutes man's work. And when those assumptions don't align with her beliefs about who she is, she undergoes the trappings of manhood in a performative sense to fulfill the role of detective in a way she deemed correct.
I'm not interested in hanging out, and neither am I interested in you two.
But they're not the only ones. And it all cycles back to a general interpretation of people in relation to a system. Persona 4 is really concerned with people not necessarily just injecting themselves into an environment, except for Narukami because he's the player character, but as inheritors of their immediate socio-economic background. And this discussion of inheritance threads throughout the game. Yukiko's main dilemma is that she's going to inherit an inn that effectively she doesn't want to inherit. Rise, who retreats back to Inaba because of deep-seated uncertainties about a long-standing career in the idol industry, goes back to her grandmother's tofu shop. Both of them, at the conclusion of their social links, go back to the same industries that they initially found so exhausting, but now on their terms.
I've made up my mind about something. You see, I'm thinking of going back into showbiz this spring.
They want to do it now. And this isn't a discussion on whether that's good or bad, like I don't care, but it demonstrates how structures affect people and how it's really hard to just will yourself out of relations of production. Even characters that don't necessarily seem like they're inheriting anything at all come in with expectations that are less directly socioeconomic and more regarding who they are. Chie, for example, isn't the inheritor of an inn or a clan or a company or tsunami of fans. She just really likes kung fu films, has an insane third level attack skill, and some of the dirtiest gameplay in a fighting game.
Shadow Chie. Damn, ranked is full of scumbags, huh?
She defines herself in relation to something extant, Yukiko. At the start of the game, Chie's relation to Yukiko is kind of like Yukiko's relation to the Amagi Inn. Both of them, despite their professed enjoyment of the other, nevertheless start off the game with deep-seated insecurities about what or who they're being defined in relation to. Yukiko hates the inn. She feels trapped and she doesn't want to be the proprietress. Chie is jealous of Yukiko. She doesn't like being compared to her, so she supposedly relishes in the control she has over her. And similar questions of inheritance shows up in Yosuke, who is the son of the Junes general manager, and he's called the Prince of Junes, and he gets, by proxy, some of the animosity that's emerged as a result of Junes choking out local businesses. Not as much or as deeply as the others, but it's still kind of there. In fact, the only ones who don't seem to revolve around these themes are Teddy and Narukami. But they're also characters who somewhat lack clear interiority, albeit for really different reasons. Teddy's lack of interiority is precisely his character arc. He's trying to come to gripes with his existentialist concern, this fear of being empty that makes him a sort of flow monster, in that he doesn't have this core, immutable, innate component to him that makes him him, but he's a constitutive subject, a thing that exists by the presence of things in motion. Narukami is, well, he's the player character. But narratively speaking, this focus on inheritance kind of plays out in terms of Persona 4's overall story beat as well. Persona 4 is kind of a smorgasbord of a lot of genre elements, and part of that broadness is what makes it broadly attractive. So on one hand, it has this whole murder mystery element. Persona 4, while it doesn't necessarily draw upon the logical deductive power of Japan's orthodox mysteries, or its metafictional new orthodox mysteries, it embodies questions you'll see crop up fairly often in some of these stories. Questions about modernity, heavy dollopings of commodified psychoanalysis, and while it's not one-to-one, the shadows can be seen as loose adaptations of doppelgangers, something that was popularized by a circulation of translation and articulation in Japanese detective fiction. So it makes a lot of sense that this game about self and other in this dying town where you employ Jungian psychoanalysis to make like Satan also happens to be a murder mystery. You know, it really hits that vibe. Part of this is because I think Persona has a tendency to capture anime and manga sentimentalities a few years after they hit their stride. Another form you'll see is like survival type fiction, right? Stories of young people fighting against each other to demonstrate their understanding of the game that is neoliberal Japan. That forms the socioeconomic core of Persona 5. The whole idea of Persona 5 is effectively a tried and true rendition of young people fighting against each other in a system that loves to pit them against each other. But those reflections happened quite a few years after the heyday of these types of stories. The main thing I'm stressing is that Persona tends to lag behind trends in genre fiction. And so with that in mind, let's sort of bookend the summary discussion. Let's talk about what actually has been talked about regarding Persona 4. There's a lot of people talking about Persona 4 as a piece of media, and there's a lot of interesting takes on it. The first tends to be general perspective analysis, how Persona makes someone feel some way about something, and it makes a lot of sense. It's the swan song of the PS2, captures a very specific era, and easily embodies a mood of wistfulness through its rural setting. In fact, that's one of the main reasons people start off Persona analysis. The game gives this sort of hometowny feel. It's what's called furusato, which literally means old village, but the language is loaded with a very specific kind of imagination, and it's usually used to mean something like hometown. Furusato as a topic is fascinating, because it doesn't just mean a hometown, but it's a word that acts like a shorthand that marks a set of social and political practices in relation to nostalgia. So when people talk about the rustic nostalgia of it, they're kind of doing what part of the game's ideology wants them to do. The rustic elements, I keep using that word. These elements of Persona 4 aren't by mistake. They recall a sense of pastoral longing, a far-off nativist belonging, which of course is always reflected in what the imaginer believes is worth capturing. So when you see a video like Persona 4 reminds me of better days, that's literally what it wants you to feel. A sense of longing to some deferred, unreal place. And a lot of this is because, on a general level, Furusato, or the vibe of Furusato, is partly about close relationships between people and environments. It's an enactment of a kind of social commentary imposed by an imagination of people which sometimes don't actually have those connections.
Prince Edward Island became a famous destination for Japanese female tourists, and some tourists even thought of it as a furusato away from home.
You can see it in Persona and how it captures the imagination of its pilgrimages. The town is based mostly on Fuefuki and possibly Fujiyoshida in Yamanashi. There's a sense of augmented realness in this process, and that magnifies the stakes in the games. One of the things that's important is that Furusato also talks about sustainability. It's why even after the events like the 2011 tsunami, when people were actually moving back, there's still this consistent framework that Furusato is lost. The word doesn't just refer to a place, because even if you've gone back, things are gone, but more so a mode of existence where somebody grows up, lives, raises children, and then dies. This is relevant to Persona because it asks questions of sustainability. Junes is coming in to kill the town and all of its small businesses. There's an ominous fog. People are dying. Young people are leaving. Young people are dying. Some of these people you know. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense that Persona would tug at your nostalgia strings and make you think of better days, because that's kind of what it's trying to do. It's built on this sort of reproductive cultural practice of fractal nostalgia, and like some multi-headed beast, it spawns more and more affect. The second types tend to be explanatory or character analysis. A lot of Persona 4 videos focus on 2 points. What is the core critical character issue at play, and how does it operate, and or how? Does it relate to its somewhat inchoate symbolism? Or what is the mythology of Persona 4? What is going on with Yosuke? What's going on with Adachi? What is the Midnight Channel? Sorry I doubled up on you there. I think it's just you covered every topic under the sun, so It's easy to use you as an example. These topics are pretty straightforward. It's interesting to piece together narrative threads and how they behave, and ultimately what sort of insights we can generate as a result of these questions. These are important things because I think it gets at the heart of how symbolism functions and acculturates. It also makes what is already an intimate story feel more intimate. But for a game about media, there's not that much about Persona as a media metaphor, and it's not subtle about its deployment of media. The game constantly bombards you with screens. Chromatic aberration is everywhere. Everything, the moment you start the game, is concerned with static and flicker. The game's opening animation in Golden is literally a motion trail echo, something you'll generally see as part of broadcast television. More specifically, Persona 4 is reflective of certain sentiments, especially in terms of how it thinks of media. And in this case, I don't mean media as just facets of media, but media as something interruptive. We usually don't think of media beyond delivery machines, TVs, platforms, cinemas, phones, consoles. It's precisely one of the first things cultural theorist Raymond Williams actually warns us when he mentions media, that it's an intermediary and substance all in one, an operation belied by an interlocked material and semiotic system, and something that gives rise to certain forms. It's why when you open a book like Understanding Media, you have a discussion on electric light, or why media theory in Japan, you have sections devoted to shopping districts and urban planning. These are media, but we tend to think of media as very specific things, and this departure is kind of important. Media informs how people are affected by objects, how someone relates, digests, and interprets something in an environment is going to be mediated. In fact, if we think about what I said earlier about how characters are inheritors of specific things, we can think about how these specific things in areas shape subjects like Kanji, Naoto, Yukiko, Yosuke. They're all people who understand themselves in relation to a zone.
Fine. I look at that big ocean out there and think, man, why keep hanging on to all this embarrassment? Just let it go.
They have goals and dreams and want to achieve them, but it's always done because a framework precedes the moment of self-actualization. The infrastructure of Inaba and its connection to other places through tunnels like portals is itself a form of mediation. It's also a way to hide loading screens, but it demarcates space as a separate thing. But most specifically, in Persona 4, the real meat exists in television. If we look at TV in Persona 4, we can extend some of the things we know about TV into a broader discussion that reflects back on how we generally engage with media overall. So now let's actually get to the analysis part of this video. Let's actually talk about Persona 4 and television. And it's still going to be a little bit messy. Now let's be clear. Shin Megami Tensei is no stranger to technology in a broad sense. Its first entry, Digital Devil Story, concerns a young man, apparently a reincarnation of Izanagi, Wikipedia is to be believed, who summons a demon using a computer program. This isn't that strange. The interplay of science fiction and fantasy sometimes overlaps in all the ways that matter. This is why Wendy Chun talks about computational logic of software as sorcery. A spell and process have actually a lot in common. They compress things together and form a process of intricate instructions into an object.
Code has a semantic meaning, but it also has an enactment of meaning. Code has both a legible state and an executable state.
And you can see that today. Rokuda Nashi Majutsu, not to be mixed with Rokuda Nashiko, the Japanese sculptor who crowdfunded a 3D scan of her vulva, uploaded it to the internet for all to print, and then rode down the Tamagawa River in a giant kayak version of her vulva, got arrested, and then ended up being, and I quote, the first woman in Japanese history tried on grounds of obscenity as spelled out in Article 175 of the Criminal Code of Japan. Not her. In Rokuda Nashi Majutsu, Akashic Records for short, the protagonist is able to condense the complexity of magic spells into a process.
深層意識に覚え込ませた術式を有効にするキーワード。それが呪文だ。要は連想ゲームさ。
And this relationship between magic and technology forms the core of Shin Megami Tensei, a relationship two technology threads throughout the SMT games. Devil Survivor 2, for instance, happens through cell phones. The whole platform-oriented anxiety is one where demonic invaders come through telecommunication towers. And beyond Persona 4, both Persona 5 and Persona 3 employ technologies, even if they vary wildly. Persona 5, for instance, moves entirely through two critical sites, smartphones and forum boards. Both of them feed into each other in a way that sort of leads all of the main characters in that game throughout the plot. The loading screens are quite literally this completely non-responsive affection meter that doesn't dynamically scale to player action, but it does kind of suggest where you are in the plot. And Persona 3 has the Evoker, which, while it doesn't necessarily come to mind when we think of media and technology, it is a technology nevertheless. The ability to summon the persona comes through the activation of this device that configures a person in a specific way. It makes them someone ready to summon a persona. But Persona 4 is fascinating in the sense that it's deeply focused on technology, especially televisual technology, but in a kind of elegiac sense. So before I talked about Furusato and the sort of deployed nostalgia that comes with that term. And in a lot of ways, we can kind of think of the energy of Persona as capturing that, but for technology. It's kind of interesting, right, that despite Persona 4 happening years after Persona 3, its technological imagination acts as if it hasn't. Narukami comes from the big city, Tokyo, to the rural areas, and he doesn't spend much, if any time, keeping track of any friends through bulletin boards or messages, forums, or MMORPGs. You're telling me this man who's able to woo every single woman in this goddamn town apparently he has no friends in Tokyo to keep in touch with? In fact, most of what connects Inaba on a social level seems to very deliberately recall a sense of nostalgia on this technological basis. In Inaba, the existence of the internet is really thin. There are relatively few references to contemporary media modes, and while they've got cell phones, they use it to talk.
Hey, did you see that? That was Yukiko-san for sure.
Most of what acts as the connective media through the story is television. So let's actually talk about television.
Yeah, there, boy. You think you're so clever. Well, I know exactly where you got that argument from.
Well, he's got a point.
So I'm Tom Lamar. I'm currently working at University of Chicago, and I work actually in 3 different programs. Main program is Cinema and Media Studies, which is self-explanatory. And I'm also in East Asian Languages and Civilizations. Probably also makes sense. But I'm also in a program called the Committee on Environmental Geography and Urbanization, which is more about environment and ecologies. And I guess my research sort of spans those 3 different domains.
It's Tom. If you're familiar with the channel, he's been a guest before, and while he's largely known for his book, The Anime Machine, what's more relevant to this discussion is his 2018 book, The Anime Ecology, which expands the question of anime to media beyond individual units of operation.
When I was writing The Anime Machine, I initially wanted to be super ambitious. I really wanted to write about the production or creation of anime, then distribution and circulation of anime, and then finally reception of anime. So I kind of thought about it in 3 parts, but in fact the first part ended up becoming a book, so it just became Anime Machine. And in that book, I sort of make some gestures towards thinking about distribution and circulation, but just gestures. So really the follow-up project, and it's almost embedded in the original book. In fact, part of the anime ecology was just chapters that were excised from Anime Machine. It was just too long. But obviously, if you're going to study anime, at some point you have to think about television. Because in fact, most of the things we think of as anime are television.
The relationship between anime and television is important because a discussion about anime has to grapple with the discussion on television. And that cuts to the core of how Persona 4 thinks about TV media. For example, when you talk about anime, people oftentimes mark Osamu Tezuka's Astro Boy in 1963 as the first anime, but have you ever thought about why that's the case? And there's like stuff before. Japanese animation existed. Some of it existed even on TV, but the reasoning, which we often don't think about, is that anime, as we think about it as something to analyze, oftentimes comes in with the assumption that it, on a lot of levels, has televisual productive connotations.
In anime ecology, I wanted to think, if you will, about the abstract machine of television. television's super complicated, right? Because you can't study television as an isolated object on a screen only. And you have to think of the platform, you have to think of the platform networked into infrastructures, and then you have the history of infrastructures themselves. And of course, the whole realm of production shifts dramatically too, because people don't sit at home and make TV shows and then try to get them into theaters. You literally get broadcasters asking people to fill slots and so forth.
This is quite important. We generally think of anime in the world of streaming services, but the logic of anime is something shaped by television. And television isn't just, the box that sits in front of us. It's a connection of wires and radio waves and broadcasters and filters through an array of commercials and sponsors slotted into time slots with a history that can go back decades.
Actually, I would argue, and I guess I do argue in anime ecology, there are two machines that are really important, and they often get confused. On the one hand, when we first think of TV, we think of broadcasting and we think of that history, right? So we think of transmission from a centralized force to an audience who receive TV shows. Usually we think of living rooms or whatever, some kind of domestic space. But in fact, very early on, and I would argue from the 1970s in Japan, when both VCRs and video console games began to, really become important, you're plugging things into your television set. And so your television set is no longer a broadcasting system. It is a computer network, essentially. You might call it a proto-computer network, but anyway, it's a network device. And now suddenly you have this other aspect of television that is a machine. It's always stretched across the possibility of being broadcasting or being something we associate with the internet, a point-to-point connection.
Hit your TV to a Telstar.
So that was the first sort of machine of television I was really interested in as an abstract level. Like, what does it mean to constantly be caught between this sense that all of this could be centralized or all of this could be horizontalized into networks?
Television is fascinating because of its capacity as an input-output machine, that not only does it take peripheral devices, but also changes the nature of its content based on the configuration of input-output. Unlike novels and radios, which tend to be unipolar, and cinema, which tends to hide connections, television engages with, and in many instances begins its content at the moment of connection. VCR TV and gaming console TV are both TVs, but they're different forms of TV.
The second machine for me was really the way in which people talk about social implications of television, and it's never resolvable. Some people argue that television is always totalizing, right? And we associate that with broadcast. And there's even kind of a history, right? The history of television is one in which we associate it with 1930s in Japan, Germany, England, mass culture, all of these kinds of things that give the state a totalizing formation. But at the same time, as we know, television is super individualizing. Like, even if you go on Netflix, it may be an illusion of individualization, but it's constantly like, oh, what do you like? Who are you? What kind of person are you? What's your demographic? And, for me, that was the second important machine, that there's both a technical machine that is about this problem of, if you will, networking, and then there's a social machine that's right alongside it, that's about individualizing and totalizing procedures.
So why is this relevant to Persona 4? Well, Persona 4 is fascinating because on both narrative and mechanical levels, the game is heavily focused on television as a machine, and consequently, what a focus on that machine does. For example, we can think of the input-output logic of television in Persona. As more victims fall into the TV world, the dungeons expand, the world expands, and it's still the TV world, but it generates a different configuration, a different instance of a TV world that is still networked together. Your party members form the psychical connection that links you to the dungeon, just like how VCRs and gaming consoles link to potential modes of existence and engagement. And it's not really something you see return in, say, Persona 5, which uses mementos instead of network personalized dungeons. I mean, yeah, there are personal areas, but once those plot beats are resolved, they close up. Here, that doesn't happen. Less abstractly, the whole thing happens through television. The events you have coming up, who's going to be the next victim, how you jump in and out, even the consequences of those murders, like bodies hanging upside down on telephone poles. Television broadcasts the entire year you're at Inaba. The interface of television plays this informing role. When you enter, there's this static that lingers. Monitors are everywhere. When you get into battle, there's a slide of RGB. And even the television itself carries this somewhat late-night anime shinya time slot. And to go into the television world, there's the whirl of chromatic aberration, which is reminiscent of flickering. And this is kind of the point, because it kind of refers back to a moment where these relations are really clear. On December 16, 1997, an episode of Pokemon plays, provoking epileptic seizures in around 700 children across Japan, which culminated in photosensitive epileptiform responses affecting possibly as much as 100,000 people. In response, broadcaster TV Tokyo suspends the series, study teams are created, and a series of recommendations of animation broadcasters and producers were suggested, up to and including a warning for people to sit at a distance. But here's the thing. The Pokemon incident, or Pokemon shock, wasn't the first case, and as it was mentioned by others at the time, the flashing of red and blue in that style wasn't the only time it happens in anime. So, why was the Pokemon shock a problem?
That's what interested me, because initially you think, oh, it is just that red-blue flash. But it's not exactly the red-blue flash only. It's also the fact that the TV episode was filmed at a certain frame rate that when it hit the broadcasting frequency, created that. So you can't really say the effect was in the animation or in the television. It was this weird moment of fusion where animation and television, if you will, work together or meshed to produce something unusual.
See, what happened at the time was a lot of animation was still shot on film at a frame rate of 24 frames per second. When you change that to a 60-frame broadcast standard, that interpolated the frame rate, creating 3 red fields and 2 blue ones. The 12 Hz flicker, in effect, created something new. But people will remember that the Pokemon incident wasn't only made as a result of frame rates and broadcasting. It was actually a perfect storm, sitting in specific places, in specific lighting conditions for specific times, broadcasted on specific waves, in specific frame rates. It actually demonstrated how a whole bunch of elements made pinning down a specific cause really hard, and yet, at the same time, really showed how television and televisual anime on a machine wasn't just, the box. But what we know of television is upheld by an infrastructure of things which makes the box possible. And when these things go awry, we notice it really well. To be affected by watching TV in that way wasn't just an error on the screen, but errors at every level, from the space in which you're watching to the space in which it's producing, twisted together to form a sort of electrical leviathan that we know as Pokemon shock. And this is how we come back to Persona 4. The scatter of color as we enter the TV world, Narukami's headache when he first comes across the Midnight Channel, the hushed whispers of all the students who swear up and down they're seeing something. These are all television, insofar as television is a vortex machine, a thing that compresses a bunch of flows and standard, and in doing so lets something flicker back. But what it flickers back is kind of interesting. The investigation team is built entirely on the assumption that what the TV reflects is true, that what it refracts back is some critical quintessential component. But the TV doesn't tell you the truth, it distorts things around it. As the game proceeds, the investigation becomes more fraught. When you come across the first real deduction check, Namatame, it has largely occluded most of your interactions with him. The player's only real frame of reference is that he's tied to Mayumi Yamano from the beginning, but the whole purpose of the investigation is to remind you, in effect, that there's something else. The TV doesn't lie to you as much as it distorts the truth. Rather, you need to do more to reach out to the truth. And nowhere is the relation between television and the viewer more enacted than in terms of how it sets up its rules-based arguments. So let's take a look at Persona based on its structure, especially considering how it employs parasociality to make that connection. Let's take a little bit of a theoretical detour. If you ever come across video game analysis, you'll probably come across this term a lot: procedural rhetoric. In short, it's a term coined by Ian Bogost about arguments made through rules-based representation and interaction, oftentimes mechanics. Bogost actually has a really cute example.
So this is a game for kids that I used to play a lot with my kids. You run away from home and you go to this town called Animal Crossing, and there are these cute animals, and you're the only human, and you get to live in this great town, and that's the whole game. But one of the weird things about the game is that you start with nothing. You have nothing, and so mercifully you are given the opportunity to work your way up. And Tom Nook, who is the local real estate tycoon, shopkeeper, slumlord, he gives you a house, and then you have to start working for him. So it's this very strange game in which you buy the game for like $50 for your 8-year-old or whatever, and you take it home and you put it in the Nintendo, and you boot it up, and the first thing that happens is you get a mortgage. You can collect different objects, and you can buy stuff to customize your house, and shirts and furniture and that kind of thing. My kid was 5, and he'd been playing this game a lot, and he told me that he had a problem that he wanted to talk with me about, and this was the first time that it really happened with my son, so I was very kind of chuffed to be having this paternal moment. Well, tell me what's wrong, son, and he said, okay, well, I have so much stuff in my house. I have the pear couch and the space station and all those shirts I made. I've got so much stuff in my house, I can't even walk around in my house. And I realized at this point that he was talking about Animal Crossing. So he said, I need more space. I need a bigger house to hold my stuff. And he said, but the problem is that I spent all my money on the stuff that I bought to put in my house, so I don't have any money left to pay my mortgage. So what do I do, Dad? And I was like, in a very real way, this is a more sophisticated conversation about long-term debt than most adults have had, right?
In short, rules set up specific situations where people logically can start to express themselves in certain ways that are commensurate with what a game's developers might be trying to argue. Some of this can come down in very pointed ways. For instance, in Monopoly, originally a critique of landlord capitalism, it hides its argument through its late game. Savvy players start off by buying whatever plots they can, up to and including taking out loans, since players can only develop squares when they have access to an entire block. So the idea, therefore, is that players block off other players by refusing to relinquish their holding on property. Developer Greg Kostikian, he didn't develop Monopoly, that was by Lizzie Maggie, but separate developer, once described the game as having an excruciatingly extended endgame. And well, yeah, that's kind of the point, right? In Monopoly, when players have blocked off other players from developing, they either choose to stop playing the game, cheat, or they build alliances, oligopolies, and in hopes that eventually later on, they will be the ultimate winner. None of this critique is enshrined in the game's rules. It doesn't point at you that way, but it leads players to behave in ways that are made possible as a result of rules laid down by the game's initial parameters.
And use trades to get yourself a monopoly and the cash necessary for 3 houses, while trading your opponent properties that leave their properties either incapable or too poor to build 3 houses of their own.
In other words, the establishment of rules creates a process internalized by players that can, in some ways, be commensurate with a concept or argument. They're getting hailed. So why does this happen? Well, let's talk about the other Bogost book, the one that doesn't get referenced as much. In Unit Operations, Bogost notes that the way in which we relate to something in terms of how to make an argument is embedded in experience, even if it's something we don't necessarily have direct experiences with. So think about it this way. How many of you are firefighters? Like, if you actually are, let me know, I'll pin your comment. But we have this idea of firefighters and what they entail based upon assumptions and relations of what we know or believe firefighters do. So, if we want to communicate something and then talk about what that thing does, how do we do it? And let's be clear here, I don't mean something like the CSI effect where people have demonstrably false understandings of courtrooms and criminal proceedings and, based upon television, but I mean, even if you know how firefighting works, suppose you want to map it into a quantifiable, replicable experience. Okay, why am I using an example of firefighters? We actually have a really good example in a really famous game. That's right, let's talk about Overcooked 2 is a game where you can play co-op or against another team, and in doing so, you learn how to effectively communicate with each other in order to beat them, or to succeed. So the rules here are setting up a pretty interesting direction. The insanity of the stages of Overcooked 2 incentivizes players to behave in a specific way commensurate to an idea. That is, effective kitchen management requires strong communication and coordination. Nobody cooks in a kitchen like this, at least not in a serious commercial setting. There's probably some frightening Food Network show that does this, but the insanity of some of these stages creates the right amount of difficulty to force players to engage in a specific way. You need to coordinate and communicate to do well.
That's prep. Ya está preparado.
Plato.
Ahí está, plato.
These goddamn Hispanics are too loud.
This is how an argument gets nestled in a rule set. When a series of conditions funnel you into accounting for certain behaviors, we have the beginning of a procedural argument.
Good job.
Okay, where's the plate?
I'll clean the plate. I'll clean the plate.
Dude, dude, we're getting bottlenecked, dude. Clean the plate. Who's cleaning the plate?
And this is because the game reflects not a real kitchen, but an imagination of things you do in a kitchen. This is at the heart of a simulation, creating, in essence, approximations of what we believe to be elements of an experience through these rules. And in doing so, we lay claims about what essentializes those experiences. There are things you do and won't do in Overcooked that comprise the kitchen experience. And in the process of replicating it, we actually make claims about what we believe those things to be. But it's important because what we represent straddles this really difficult line between depending on representation and rejecting it. Bogas calls this simulation fever, a play on Derrida's archive fever, which itself was a look at how we preserve things by laying claims and, in essence, defining what we should forget. So think about it this way. A simulation lays boundaries about what we believe to be essential elements of something experience. That the replication of something is also exercising what we believe it is. A procedural argument is where we start to make arguments about that thing through its simulation. Is what we're talking about replicated through simulation good or bad? What does it tell us about a subject? What should or can it tell us? These sort of questions are stuff that can be asked through rules. So here's a question. What is Persona 4 simulating?
I mean, I think one of the reasons why Persona 4 gravitates to television broadcast is it's a rural game. It takes place in a rural area. How do they envision media in that rural space? They do envision it rather differently than an urban space. But I think what they're doing with TV is pretty true to what that entire broader franchise does. Because ultimately what's important with television are these parasocial relations.
Parasociality is a crucial component in how television is presented in Persona 4. Usually, when we think of parasociality, we tend to think of an occluded, one-sided relationship. The relationship between, say, you and your favorite content creator is one-dimensional in the sense that your investment into them is imagined.
Oh, cool. Thanks for the donation.
That's not an innately bad thing. In fandom studies, parasociality is depathologized in a lot of instances because it actually gives a lot of insight into how fandoms form networks of affect, but it doesn't necessarily lead to directly negative social consequences. The word is often employed to imply something nefarious. After all, a core element to understanding relationships between people is the consent of it, an awareness of social reciprocity. But it's also a little normative. That conception of parasociality is important, but if we believe that that's the only dimension of parasociality that matters, then we run into an issue that this is just how it should be, and deviancy from that expectation of what good relationships are end up being yielded in institutionally damaging ways. Realistically, the technical term of parasociality is really only when one side invests into a relationship, and the object of one's affection is not accounted for.
4 years ago, I'd say I would sacrifice my life for him.
This could lead to some bad things, but there's two important elements here. One, it doesn't always, and two, what if the object of affection isn't a person? Gilbert Simon makes an interesting note in that when we think about aesthetic objects, we give them a lot of theoretical heft, that these narratives and forms and designs bracket or refract some element of the human idea.
Culture thus has two contradictory attitudes toward technical objects. On the one hand, it treats them as pure assemblages of matter, devoid of true signification and merely presenting a utility. On the other hand, it supposes that these objects are also robots and that they are animated by hostile intentions toward man, or that they represent a permanent danger of aggression and insurrection against him. Come on, Joe. What the hell was that?
But there's less of a focus on technical objects. In other words, we tend to think of objects as things in relation to its use. But wait a minute, the differences between objects inform how we think of relations of them. Simondom is essentially arguing that the things we usually see as a pathway to a content is itself an argument. Technical form informs an argument on its own. You can see this in fan art. People will draw the same things, but they'll nevertheless develop preferences because form plays a critical role in dictating how people relate to it. Television, in this sense, is really apropos because it crafts a kind of intimacy. The thing is in your home, broadcasting to you, speaking to you, looking you in the eyes without the pomp and frump of the cinema. Like, in the movie theater, we know they're acting. We know it. But on TV, who knows? Maybe that guy is as cool as we think. Now, some of you hearing me ramble here might think, well, wait a minute. Technological modes of relation of existence generated one-sidedly would shape modes of analysis? It sounds like 2D complex. Sounds like moi.
You end up playing with computer-generated figures. You have to have real social relations with non-human modes of existence in order to do what you do. So what interested me, like in the arc of doing a book that's more centered on television, is you can also say that television Persona 4 functions a lot like a cell phone, and functions a lot like other technologies, and that it's about a televisual field that is producing new ontological modes of existence. And you have to develop a technical, social, and psychological relation with these parasocial entities in order to make your way through this world.
If we talk about Persona on the basis of its examination of television, we see a discussion about parasociality, about interruptions in media production, but we also see, interestingly, an alternative path in theoretical questions shared with subjects like moe. Moe generally has a much less negative connotation than parasociality, but bringing this up in Persona is useful because Persona 4 ends up tying some of its self-reflexive analysis on parasociality and interruptive technology back as like a sort of affect. Much of the social links in Persona 4, by virtue of the intimate setting of the rural town, is about some really compromised interiorities that they need to deal with. And I think that's why we see so much debate about the natures of character like Kanji and Naoto. They can't reply back to us outside of what's in the game, and any relation we have with them is effectively one-sided.
Even if that girl doesn't write me letters, I bet she'll still watch me if I'm on TV.
Well, of course, Joe. Of course they're not real. I know that. But think about what that actually means. Many of us feel a specific way about these non-human entities in a sense that makes us respond and suppose about their nature in a way as if they were. At no moment or point do they actually respond back to us, but we're stuck in a specific kind of generative affect economy. We feel about this world and its people in a way not dissimilar from the way in which we feel about things we see on other media, which at the time of Persona 4 very much included television. All they do is react to our decisions, to what we say. They follow along. Now, this isn't something unique to Persona 4. It's a pretty standard fare in visual novels, and Persona 3 and Persona 5 both employ social links. But it's really apropos in Persona 4 because Persona 4 is specifically about a parasocial technology. television, and our relationship both as players and as interpreters of the non-human subjects presented in Persona 4 as constantly negotiated through a percolation of this technology. And we can see how it takes on this extremely atmospheric form. The fog is this persistent occlusion that, well, acts like a fog. It permeates the entirety of Inaba and reveals the consequences of interpretation when it parts. It's a fairly common thing to see in science fiction. Susan Napier calls this the machine stop moment, where there is a glimpse of utopia, mainly to stress that imagination is possible, but the nature of that utopic vision is never clear. In Persona 4, this parting is constant. It happens iteratively and it's really utopic in a weird sense. The only moments where the fog clears for good is when the final truth is revealed, and strangely enough, Junes fixes everything and Inaba survives after all. Like, the best ending is extremely utopic. Now, if the player doesn't pursue that and instead goes for the bad or the Joker ending, the fog persists. It continues to occlude. Another example is how so much of this game is scandal, both big and small. The game heavily emphasizes construction and reconstruction of its suppositions of its people, which are notably manufactured and then abstracted through television. And I don't mean that in the concept that the people are fake, the characters are fake. I mean that in the sense that our understanding of them is always negotiated at first by what TV and rumors say. The first plot point we see is Namatame, whose career is destroyed by the affair he has with Mayumi Yamano, the Mayumi Yamano scandal, who is interestingly a TV announcer, a job that really only exists on TV. Namatame's arc is really fascinating because while he shows up at moments during the game, you only interact with him in terms of his acts, and more interestingly, when you're tasked with getting at the truth of it, you have to do it as his shadow purposely sets up a false narrative. The TV, in this sense, is not a site that makes you peer at some greater interior truth, but it actively is presented as discordant with Namatame's true feelings. And it makes sense. A week after the Golden adaptation, Hashino mentions that Persona 4 was developed during a time when there was real concern over uncritical consumption of information, primarily through TV programs. Now let me be clear, I'm not just talking about how Persona 4 thinks technology, but how Persona 4 thinks of specific broadcast-oriented technology. This is why Simondon's argument that the technical aspect of an object is itself a generator of intellectual and aesthetic criticisms. The other Persona games do think about technology's relation to society. Persona 3 examines legacies. People are affected by legacies and surrender themselves to machinery, up to and including people who are directly machines themselves. Persona 5 is all about atomization and precarity and the contradiction of technology. It levies the forum board to connect people together, but always from the individualized space of their smartphones. But Persona 4 is a bit of a different beast because it's about how images generate subjects, and assumptions about what makes someone who they are threads throughout the entire game, up to and including moments where the player is sometimes at odds with what the game sets up diegetically. In fact, that happens a lot in Persona 4. We're privy to a lot of things that diegetically the game just takes for granted. Like, we know that's probably Rise, Naoto is probably a girl, Mitsuo Kubo is probably not the killer, but the internal world never breaks the genre awareness of it. There's always some meta-awareness used that somewhat situates us as people watching, even while playing. So where am I going with this? What are the stakes? Persona 4 is a really fascinating piece, primarily because of how we think about an examination of space and technology. It nestles its performance and reflexivity in a single package. The Midnight Channel isn't just the direct flickering light that hums after rainy nights, but it comes at you through someone else. Watching TV doesn't begin at actually watching TV. I know that sounds kind of stupid, but it begins at the awareness to watch TV. So much of this game sets up televisual watching as a focal point. The rumors of the Midnight Channel begin elsewhere, and you have to verify it yourself. Before you even know to keep an eye out for someone, they always show up on the TV, or there's something on the TV which informs the whole string of events. And even when you save someone, you can only verify the efficacy of your efforts through the empty static of television.
I was pissed off. I wanted to be famous.
The whole thing is a giant spectacle machine, colloquially speaking, where images comprise of social relations.
But when I noticed how clear the image was on TV, I knew something was different. So I called Chie, and while we were talking, it hit me. Maybe that boy is the culprit.
And it happens on quite a few levels. The rumors and judgments people make about people around them, which sets up the social links and dilemmas you as the player engage in. But you yourself also engage in this in the sense that what you're manipulating is functionally unreal.
People started to talk about that as early as the 1950s. That you had the sense that the images on TV were characters you could connect to. So André Bazin, the famous film scholar, said, it's weird with television because I see the news reporter on the street and I want to walk up and shake his hand because he's my friend. And I would never do that with a film actor. And, so that was the first moment people started to think about why the kind of social technical apparatus of television was producing that. And I think, that was one of the genealogies I wanted to track. By the time you get to Persona 4, that's just built into it. And it's constantly leading you in a space of, where you don't even have to test that relationship. Is it a player character? Is it an NCP?
In a way, a look at Persona 4 through the lens of television is you're playing television, which is a strange thing to say at a glance. But if you think about it, it makes questions of spectating and consideration and navigating an atmospheric zone of broadcasting and machinery and ecologies pretty fun. The rumors and discussion, late night slots, the unrealness of certain things, the incessant navigation of screens and half-truth.
Everyone's talking about it, right?
It's a persistent hum of the wire that at the end of the day, you end up at the living room by the TV, to take a brief look at the weather, to regulate and define your life, to do things that determine the truthfulness of your justice. It's a parasocial machine about parasociality, a portal to a means to watch and engage, and in the process, think about how to engage. In a way, it's really fascinating and kind of emblematic of a lot of concerns about television. And it stands quite unique. Or does it?
Okay, let's try and keep this under 1 minute. This video has been brought to you by the kind support of all of my patrons on Patreon. Patreon is realistically the main lifeline of this channel. Without it, it effectively makes no money. Patreon realistically is how this channel is able to get more material, get new gear, all that kind of stuff. And so it's been extremely helpful when it comes to making sure that what I need to do gets done. I know I don't upload videos a lot. Using Patreon, I try to keep people up to date. So if you want to see my progress on any given video, I always try and keep people up to date through that platform. In addition to that, if you really like weird movie reviews without any kind of context, Patreon is where I upload a lot of my movie reviews. I try to upload them onto my second channel as well. If you're a patron, you can also request movie reviews, but they're not particularly good. It's just...
Earlier, we talked about procedure, a way in which rules make arguments. How the game sets up rules and what players do with them is a form in which arguments emerge. And in Persona 4, there are ways in which the logic of the game imagines this sort of percolative vision of television as a social machine. But what if you change the rules? See, if you take a look at Bogot's persuasive games, there's a commonality in this discussion on procedural rhetoric. The bulk of the analysis focuses on single player. Now this isn't surprising. A lot of analysis of games as meaning-making devices happen because historically the meaning-making has presumed a singular operator. When we say, what does a game tell us about something, there is often the assumption that the us can be abstracted into a single person. Here, a specific relationship emerges. A singular operator in relation to a system generates an interpretation. And whether that's commensurate with what developers or designers intend informs the strength of a game's procedural rhetoric. There's a lot of reasons for that. Like, you generally want to develop for single player interactions because if you account for multiplayer, the possibility of players it gets real complex real fast. And then when you're dealing with multiplayer environments, you start dealing with metas, you start to account for player behavior, start to account for culture, all that kind of stuff.
So if you take the exact same player and you put them on Ragnaros or Illidan, and if they're in the US, they're going to play better because the servers are located in the United States.
Here's the thing. Game studies was historically multiplayer oriented. Dutch historian Johan Huizinga, for instance, considers play as primordial to culture, that competitions and exhibitions as amusements do not proceed from culture, they rather precede it. French sociologist Roger Calois, who would be expanding on Huizinga's work, even accounts for competitive spaces through a group known as agonistic games. Agon for competition, Ymir for lack of presence in blood. In other words, multiplayer is at the core of game analysis, but think about how much more prevalently you probably see single player analysis. Think about how much more games analysis videos study games as theoretical, intellectual, and cultural texts on the basis of the single player interaction relationship. When we experience the meaning of a game as an intellectual aesthetic machine, the we refers to an experience negotiated in single player. When we get into games in multiplayer, you tend to find much more aesthetic and intellectual analysis devoted to its single player mode, because for the most part, that's where the clearest and most intelligible way of getting meaning is generated.
My new friends and I get our hands on it, mess around in multiplayer, getting our rocks off playing Team SWAT like the good old days. Soon, though, it was time to dust off that campaign.
When we get into the multiplayer modes in multiplayer-specific games, it tends to lean into two areas. The social makeup, i.e. who plays it, or the technical makeup, how to get good.
But the way you beat someone with superior reactions to you is find a way to use their reactions to your advantage. And that's exactly what Angry Bird did.
And that's kind of funny, right? Because that's exactly what Simonton stresses. We tend to focus on the technical aspects as a means to something more valuable, not as a site of meaning making itself. But wait a minute, Joe, didn't you use Monopoly? Isn't that an example of a game with a procedural argument that's not just competition, but supposedly a critique of landlord capitalism? Are you a hack fraud scumbag? Well, yeah. And that's why it's an interesting question, because we know that multiplayer games, by virtue of being multiplayer games, can generate interesting arguments through the way they play. In fact, what's central is not so much that multiplayer games can't have complex meanings, but that analysts tend to have difficulty figuring out meaning through these mechanics when the idea isn't something multiplayer games are already good at. Things like violence, communication, competition, those are really strong areas of multiplayer games on a procedural level, but that's because multiplayer games tend to be really good at expressing these questions. In a multiplayer game, something like Overcooked 2 is, of course, able to stress the importance of communication for effective line management, but communication is something that easily comes with the territory of multiplayer games.
There are plenty of options for two champs to work together, and pretty much every tag and assist mechanic is tied to the team button.
But how do multiplayer games present, for example, the rule set of queer identities or themes of apocalypse? And I don't mean in the sense of, do multiplayer games have queer characters, or do multiplayer games have apocalyptic settings? But on a rules level, can they simulate or grapple with these sentiments or questions when players are constantly at each other's necks? Or perhaps, are multiplayer games limited as argumentative text by the virtue of their nature as multiplayer text? This is important because minute changes to a rule set can actually shape or reflect specific relations, even with really abstract themes. Apocalypse, for example, isn't necessarily something we tend to think rule sets in multiplayer are good at, but we actually do have examples. Like, for example, redundant. For example, people generally know the Diablo games as one of two things: a seminal work in the modern day CRPG, or a goofy loot slot machine, which, to be fair, is what its creators also saw it as.
It's a slot machine. Every time you kill a monster, you put a quarter into the slot machine and you pull the lever and out can come nothing. You get your quarter back. You know, you could do pretty well or you could hit a jackpot. And so if you can think of pulling the lever as every time you kill a monster, it's got kind of this addictive quality. Just as slot machines are addictive, so is the I am going to maybe win something big here.
But one of the things that might interest you is that Diablo 2, for instance, has permadeath in its hardcore mode. So if you die, your character is deleted. That includes online. One of the major issues is whether players can actually trust each other, since if they die playing hardcore mode against, say, a PK or a troll, all of the time spent building that character is gone, permanently. For a while, some players weren't fans of this dynamic. Blogger Syrian actually mentioned that in an email to Blizzard, that hardcore could create a cataclysmic effect in which players will simply stop playing the game. In response to Syrian's concerns, Blizzard VP Max Schaefer mentioned that, famously,
"The world of Diablo 2 is not a safe, warm place. It's a place of great evil and even greater good."
It's really Junie. But it's also very demonstrative of how, with a minor modification of rules, you can change a game from a grinding slot machine into a game that performs Apocalypse while doubling as a grinding slot machine. In fact, it uses the grinding slot machine because the economy that puts players at risk is that they have to kill monsters, but to maximize your odds, you have to kill with lots of players. So what ends up happening is that it incentivizes you to be in a defensive siege mentality, since players can be the actual threat.
That sucks. Man, I couldn't imagine playing HC public games. Every time you port to someone or use a waypoint, you have to trust that nobody's being a jackass.
Most of the hardcore players are generally nice and helpful, but there are always a few that are dicks.
In my experience, the density of dicks in hardcore mode is much greater than regular mode.
The slot machine dynamic doesn't go away, but a slight change in the rules reworks a player's relationship to the game to the extent that it more accurately reflects a sentiment that wasn't there before. Let's say Persona 4 discusses television, that it's about technology in a specific way in a specific zone and reflects back on questions of, say, spectatorship and parasociality, and questions about watching. If we change it into a multiplayer game, can we still embody some of those questions? Kind of. This is going to be the part where it gets hard. In 2012, Atlus released a Persona fighting game, in a time where fighting games were making a console resurgence, at the same time as Persona 4 was also releasing the Golden Edition on the PS Vita, and at the same time Atlus was also beginning to craft their cinematic universe Media Mix Monstrosity. Originally a co-production between Atlus and Arc System Works, Arena was an anime fighting game that incorporated the characters from Persona 3 and Persona 4. Now, spin-offs are not unique to the Persona series. Atlus had a 2015 PS Vita rhythm game called Persona All Night Dancing,
all night.
and then a sequel featuring the Joker. Crossovers within the Persona universe weren't that crazy either. An Etrian Odyssey style adaptation known as Persona Q Shadows of the Labyrinth came out in 2014, which apparently was canon. But one of the big games that kickstarted this was Arena. Persona 4 Arena takes place during Golden Week, after the gang has solved the mystery. And in a bit of reminiscing, they decide to check out the Midnight Channel, because of the funny memes, one last laugh. But it turns out the Midnight Channel hasn't actually gone away. In fact, a completely different thing emerges called the Ultimate in Mayonaka Arena. Things start to escalate. Strange shadow versions of themselves start to show up, including the protagonists on the TV screens, and it's up to them to solve the mystery of what the heck is going on in the TV world this time. Oh, and the fog is red now, so it's like edgy. And that's the main premise of it, right? We don't really need to harp on the story, because frankly, it's a fighting game. Most of the interesting components are going to happen on the level of its combat interactions, not necessarily its novel-style storytelling. And I don't mean that in an insulting way. I mean that most player interactions are going to happen player to player, likely online. And spaces that are not necessarily reflected by the single-player story. Some games, Guilty Gear Strive for example, have really limited single-player gameplay, and other fighting games, like Street Fighter 4 on release, had effectively no story mode at all. If you look at Steam achievements, many players don't even finish story modes, except for the absolute creatures that are Type Lumina fans. So how do you analyze that kind of space if story becomes kind of a non-factor? Well, it's interesting because Persona 4 Arena and Persona 4 Arena Ultimax, they're like two games, are about television, or at least they reflect some of the same anxieties about television, but they do so in very different ways compared to Persona 4. Arena is an adoption of the K1 mixed martial art aesthetic, and it's not something new to fighting games, but one of the things that makes it fascinating is that it has an interesting connection to television in a different way than Persona 4. While Persona 4 arguably captures a kind of televisual experience in a specific period, the Pokemon shock,
Are you okay?
I think there are broader and yet similar questions of viewership when we talk about television in Arena.
What was that about? Is that what everyone's been seeing?
In Persona 4, I argue that television depicts a certain kind of parasocial relationship. The game employs speculation, internalization, focusing on reaching out to a truth out there, but that truth is always mediated by some technological relationship infected by scan lines and static and fog. And as Lamar notes, Persona 4's dizzying relationship with television is likely informed by its nature as a device interlocked with a bunch of standards and protocols to form an overdeterministic object. The thing you see on the television is not just present in the box, but it's determined by a bunch of hidden things around you to craft specific kinds of interpretations made possible by the zone of television. Arena, on the other hand, touches upon television along similar lines. It's concerned about spectatorship, really exemplified by its deployment of combat entertainment, specifically in terms of how it's a game is designed to be extremely watchable.
Nothing is staged or worked, folks! Yuki-chan, make sure you let your fists do the talking in the next fight, too!
In a lot of ways, it brings up similar questions of broadcasting technology just like Persona 4. But it engages with broadcasting very differently.
Hi, this is your announcer, Risette. Things are getting really heated up here. Are you ready?
Whereas Persona 4 grapples with broadcasting something unilaterally as something sent to us and around us, Persona 4 Arena, by virtue of being a fighting game in a specific period of time, reworks questions of broadcasting as expansive spaces of multipolar flows of engagements, which are reconciled at, the fight. When the round starts, that's what happens. And while Persona 4 might reflect a paradigm of television and its disparate components made visible by the Pokemon shock, Arena reflects a different paradigm of television, specifically television as a public device. So we're gonna get into that.
There used to be a fighting game magazine in Japan called, I believe it's called Arcadia Magazine, and they had a Persona takeover issue, and everyone's like, why is this RPG game on this fighting game magazine? And that's when they announced the game for the first time, and I was like, no way. Like, it was like the most random announcement you could have thought. From there, I was like, okay, can't wait for the game to come out.
This is Steve Barthélemy, and he's a player who was extremely active during the heyday of Persona 4 Arena.
I go by Lord Knight. I'm a professional fighting game player at this point.
That's what Lord Knight wants.
I like the blocks. Good stuff from Lord Knight.
That was fucking outrageous.
That's why LK likes 5C so much. Yes, that makes sense.
Oh, was that the tech?
I specialize in anime fighting games. That's what I'm the most known for. 2011, like Atlas had this huge marketing campaign about like, oh, Persona 4 is starting like IRL. Like they had this whole weird like a website that's just a TV, and they're like countdown, like all this stuff. So like I bought into the hype. I got Persona 4. And I just played Persona 4, and I was like, this game's dope. I've never played a game like that before.
This is kind of reminiscent of what we call a media mix, a multimedia franchising strategy that you'll see come up a lot in discussions regarding Japanese franchising strategies, where multiple points of media entry don't need one or the other, but benefit from each other. The media mix approach is really apropos in this discussion about how mechanics make arguments, because while stories and how they play out in Persona 4 aren't necessarily something that's easily translatable into a fighting game where a massive number of players just won't play its story mode, it's still relevant. Fighting games begin at arcades, Rachel Hutchinson notes. For fighting games, stories and characterization happen at different points. Characters precede the games.
In the modern era, generally games are already purchased and intros and title screens are used to set the tone for a player's experience. But during the arcade days, intros and attract screens were used as advertisements to, well, attract players. After all, Every game was competing with each other for your 25 cents, your 50 cents, your yen, your pesos, your dollar before you committed it to another game. Thus, the intro and attract screens were developed as a way to appeal to passerbys and customers.
This is why you have characters like Labris, which was largely unique to Arena. She was meant to be a way to capture the attention of both Persona fans and fighting game fans with very little information. This is also important since both developers make a critical note. Players understand characters through long engagements in RPGs, but they don't experience it in the same way in fighting games. And if your primary interface is the arcade, then how do you exemplify some of the vibes of the original game to make a cohesive experience? Well, it's through the characters.
So if you've never played Persona 4, Arena is kind of a weird game, but if you played Persona 4, like, it has a lot of references to the energy of the game because you know, there's like that shadow versus true self kind of dynamic going on, and Persona 4 Arena kind of references that a lot with how it displays the character. So like when you play a character, especially in vanilla, the original version, you're playing like the character, like you're playing like Narukami or Naoto or whatever, but all the ways that the game refers to the characters is like stereotypes of the characters perceived by other characters from the RPG, or perceived by people who played the game from the RPG. So they call like Narukami like the Siscon Kingpin. So the joke is like, oh, that's Bancho, like he's like a delinquent kind of, but like he likes his little sister. When you see the ways the game refers to the characters, if you don't play, you're like, that's kind of mean almost.
Sister Complex Kingpin of Steel?
But if you played the game, if you played the original RPG, you go, oh, like these are nice references to stuff that happened.
Unlike the original Persona 4, which takes time to craft out the nature of its mystery, a fighting game like Persona 4 Arena, structured for arcades, doesn't have that same kind of luxury. But simultaneously, Arena existed in a really fascinating place in fighting game history where there was also a massively concerted effort to capture a much more casual audience. See, during the early to mid-2000s, 2D fighting games weren't as popular. On the 3DN, you have a series of core games like Tekken, Soul Calibur, Mortal Kombat, which took advantage of the 3D combat space to demarcate a specific kind of fighting game subgenre. Guilty Gear was kinda running along, but for the most part, the landscape kinda looked very different than it does today. What really kickstarted the revival of the 2D fighter was Street Fighter 4. This is even more important considering that one of the major reasons, as mentioned by Maximilian, is not necessarily something with regards to the form of the game's design, but more with regards to its audience.
Another pioneering part of SF4 that you gotta give it credit for is online. And the online of SF4, at the time, was great.
Street Fighter 4 is in effect heralding a transition towards accessibility, both in terms of gameplay as well as viewing. It is a game of infrastructure. But Street Fighter 4 had a legacy. What happens when you don't?
Actually, as like a fighting game player, there's two types. There's two main types of games if you super step as far back as possible, right? Basically, there's like original / legacy IP. So that's like your Street Fighters, your Mortal Kombats. You know, in like the 90s or whatever, a bunch of people made something, it blew up, and now they can come out with like, they're coming out Mortal Kombat 1, right? So people are excited because it's this long time legacy IP. It's much harder to make something like Under Night In-Birth, for example, brand new game. At the time it came out, it was brand new. Everyone's like, what is this? We don't care. But now it's been out for a while, so people are like, oh, it's Under Night. The other type is the licensed fighters. So that's like your Persona 4 Arena, your Dragon Ball fighters. From a licensed perspective, the main challenge of making a licensed game is making it faithful to the original IP, right?
Arena began development in 2010 and with talks possibly going as far back as 2008. This was on the heels of Arc System Works' latest BlazBlue release, Continuum Shift, which was the first game in the series to implement newbie-friendly stylish type or mode. In short, this co-development would have in effect been informed by the fact that fighting games were already blowing in a really specific direction. And it was effectively the studios that were learning that they needed to get new blood in, and constantly. And this is something mentioned by its developers. They needed casual players to get into the game, and doing so needed a major revamping of the input complexity of the game.
So I think Persona did a really good job of this because the system is similar to other ArcSys games, but they changed the button setting so that like it's 4 buttons. it's A, B, C, D, but your C and D buttons are persona attacks, and your A and B buttons are physical attacks. And this like simple system lets them express what the character is in the RPG in like such a good way. So like, for example, like Chie is in the game. Chie is like the physical type, you know. So like her light attack, her attacks, like her attacking you, they're all really good. But outside like a couple tactics, she doesn't rely on her persona very much. Where like if you play like Yukiko doesn't really attack you. Like all her attacks are like persona stuff. Everything she does is persona, like from like full screen. So with this system, they were able to like not only do you like see the persona working with the character, that's how they fight in the game.
Persona 4 Arena in that vein reflected that concern. We needed to get new players. It has to look more exciting. There needs to be better infrastructure to support more expansive play, and so fighting games need to reflect it. But how do you do it?
The game did 3 things that people really, really dislike. So there's like a subtle, I'm gonna say 3, because some people who play for a long time, the biggest community at the time is usually like Capcom, so like Street Fighter or Marvel, like that type of thing. The number one thing that people hated is that the game has a system called auto combo, where you can press one button, it's the light button.
There's an auto combo. If you hit A, like the A button 6 times, you'll do a combo, an automatic combo into a super. It doesn't do very much damage. There's some actually nice benefits of using the auto combo. However, as the level of skill goes up, the game changes quite drastically.
Thing number 2 that people didn't like is that the motions are hyper simplified for a fighting game of that time. Since then, there have been other fighting games that have done this, but Persona exclusively uses quarter circles, double quarter circles, and down for special moves. That's it, nothing else. Again, this is for new people because, for example, if you look at an old commanding list from like Guilty Gear XX, for example, in Guilty Gear XX, I remember like I couldn't read the commands of some characters just because it just doesn't really make sense unless when someone writes it out for you, like a forward, down, forward, the Dragon Punch, for example. Me saying forward, down, forward, okay, right? But different games show it different way. Like some games show it as like a letter Z, and like some games they just show it in like weird ways, especially in old games. So they instead, all characters have quarter circles for everything. Everyone's either forward or back, and then everyone's super is like just 2 quarter circles, and then some characters have down, and then there's a universal mechanic. This is the 3rd thing, a universal reversal.
I gotta chill out for a minute. Oh, got DP though.
Good DP though.
So like most games, Dragon Punch, counter, stuff like that. But in Persona 4 Arena, if you mash I shouldn't say mash. If you press the B and D button at the same time, you will get a reversal.
These strategies for input simplification didn't come from Persona 4 Arena, but Arena did play a pretty crucial role in embedding it as part of its gameplay. What made Arena fascinating was how it built input simplicity as part of its structure. See, if you're not big into fighting games, you might not have known that fighting games nowadays can feel simpler, either in terms of how their inputs feel or in terms of how their characters feel. Street Fighter 6, for instance, now has classic and modern schemes, and the intention is pretty straightforward. Get new blood into the games. Make things more watchable.
The modern control type is a brand new control option created for players who want to jump right into the fight without having to focus on executing special move combinations.
Arc System Works is arguably where we can see this trend most notably. As every game they develop and publish, the inputs are slowly becoming more and more simple, and the window on inputs can feel like they're getting more and more lenient. Now this engenders a specific kind of environment that makes a space more chaotic, but it also makes things easier to watch.
So, for example, like old BlazBlue is really hard to watch if you've never played BlazBlue. You just have no idea what's going on. And they did add a couple mechanics, like the most common ones is like they add these mechanics where it either slows down or freezes the game. And from a player perspective, the extreme would be, I hate that the game is not moving. Because if you watch, like, one thing I'll always give XX is that the game is just so fast, because there's no pauses, ever.
From the fireball, hey! Crowd chanting along with their American brethren.
Where the further you go the more you'll see like Shadow Rampage is a great example. Like you pop Shadow Rampage, the screen freezes as the character activates the mode and the screen turns on. It's like letting everybody know, guess what? It's party time.
I guess he may not have been.
That'll work.
Here we go.
That'll work. Here comes the damage.
Right? Or Exert has danger time and it goes 3, 2, 1, danger, and then the screen goes dark, just like, or like the Guilty Gear Strive, the heavy counter hits. The game slows down, the camera zooms in, the song changes for a little bit and slows down too. Like it just gives you, make sure that you know it's about to go down. So I do feel like those mechanics line up with that. I mean, Awakening's like that too, right? Yeah, they have the character awakening portrait cut in the middle of the screen, like from the RPG. They do that when you activate Awakening. They do stuff kind of like to let you know hype could come or something is about to come. But the player would know regardless of what cue they give you, because they're the one, especially if they're good, like they study the game, they play the game, blah, blah, blah. But it's for people who are either don't play at all or they're just starting.
This isn't that strange. Strive's design language is focused on accessibility, getting as many people into the game as possible.
理解しやすくさせたいっていうことが一番の目的なんですよね。なんでその結果がなんか操作を減らしたりボタンを減らしたりすることなのかどうかっていうのはまだまだ決着がついてない話だと個人的には思っていまして、まあ絶賛我々はそれを模索中ですね。やはり競技ものですし、すごく強い人間プレイヤーがすごく強くあるためにはやはりそれなりのゲームとしての奥がなくちゃいけないと思いますし、その奥を表現するためのそのシステムとしては当然やはり一元さんが分かりづらいような深いシステムというのをどうしても要求されてしまうと思いますので、それをこうどういう形で導入しやすくするのか、操作なのか、理解度なのか、見た目なのかみたいなところで。
Arena, however, was interesting because it was the earliest Persona 4 adaptation, and it was a really fascinating co-production between two studios that were really familiar with each other. Kazuhisa Wada, who managed P Studio, the Atlas Persona branch at the time, specifically praised Mori Toshimichi, head of the BlazBlue team. Wada would go on to say, for example, that Arc System Works didn't just make great fighting games, they make great media centered around fighting games. And that's like business interview doublespeak, right? You know, you kind of gotta say that stuff, but it's really demonstrative of Arc System Works' design paradigm, in that games like BlazBlue were extremely fascinating in that they balanced strong fighting game awareness alongside pretty idiosyncratic design decisions. Arc System Works was really good at developing games with mechanics commensurate to the kind of settings that they wanted. So, for example, its drive system, and how many unique mechanics a single Arc System Works games can cram into character interaction possibilities. But it's also important that a lot of its audience has to be able to interpret it in a very specific way, because they're not going to be fighting game players. So a collaboration made sense. You want someone who not only knows what they're doing, but is also able to adapt what are otherwise genre-specific mechanic logics into another game. And more importantly, you want to implement strategies to get new blood into fighting games during a period of time where the 2D fighter was experiencing that resurgence.
Well, this game is very, very easy to get into. They made sure it was really easy to get into.
So, you got two strategies. Transplant non-competitive fighting game players, i.e. people who aren't sweat lords, into this genre, and two, get fighting game fans interested in the overall franchise of Persona 4. Because, you know, this is a media mix thing. So how do you reconcile both? Part of this is how it's structured. You don't realistically get into Arena just because of the story, you're going to attach to more of its characters. And the licensed IP encourages a specific kind of experience. In other words, not only does the game cater to Persona fans who might not be big into fighting games, but they also cater to fighting game players whose primary draw isn't the Persona games, but more so new fighting games in general.
Bananakin versus Lord Knight.
Which is kind of funny. In a lot of ways, Persona 4 Arena feels extremely ambitious, not only because of how it attempted to capture both audiences, but also attempted to integrate similar questions of spectating and televisual watching developed by Persona 4 in an environment that's radically different than what Atlus has done before.
The P1 Grand Prix is about to begin.
And here's the thing, I know, I was there. I saw the anime fighting game community at that time. I went to EVO in 2013 because of Arena. I spent a week on a Greyhound bus going from Toronto to Vegas and back, and look, I'm proven.
Hello?
Hey.
How's it going?
Hey, do you remember that time we took the Greyhound to Vegas?
Oh, hell no. We don't talk about that. Hello?
Yo, hey, remember that time we took the Greyhound to Vegas?
Oh.
There's some really specific ways in which it accomplishes genre translation. Like, moving from turn-based to real-time combat requires a dramatic reworking of the rules of engagement. As a fighting game player, you're not only dealing with real-time, but also against what will likely be a person. In RPGs, you deal with things like boss stages, inventory, loadout, preparation. But these sorts of things are a lot more difficult to pull off in the heat of the battle, where the collision is between two players who want to demonstrate their ability.
But this is all he can do until he gets it back.
And one of the ways it does this is in terms of its really unique loadout. Arena and Ultimax are what are called 4-button fighters, where you have 4 main attack inputs, but 2 of them, C and D, are devoted to moves for your personas.
So both before the game came out, and not since the game came out, have they made characters like that?
The main thing is that the game is interesting because unlike a lot of fighters before it treats your attacks as resources.
Oh, persona broken. This might be OK's round.
If your persona gets hit, it gets broken. And if it gets broken enough, you don't have access to half your arsenal. Resource management has always been part of fighting games, but what makes Arena interesting is that it tries to approximate resource management similarly to Persona 4. And since you can't map out stuff like turn and weaknesses, you need to funnel players into doing things that are similar to these sorts of behaviors. And one solution is that if you set up the possibility of losing access to your most powerful tools, you can take advantage of the real-time combat of fighting games to effectively force turns.
And the next mistake that I saw is something a little bit unique to this game, unique to Persona, and that's kind of punishing your opponent for whiffing their persona or like getting their persona blocked. So for example,
players in this situation need to weigh the costs of sending out their personas, which is kind of similar to SP usage, and the opponent needs to weigh the cost of punishing that persona, which creates a back and forth interaction space. So what is the stakes here? We tend to think of arguments as being informed through narratives, that the plot or the story of a game informs why certain interactions mean something in a specific way. But it also brings up an issue. If fighting game players engage in a way that tends to be quite different from how we usually craft theories of game analysis, then we have to think about whether these theories are effective at translating interactions in any analytical way. This is why we tend to skew towards players. When we think about multiplayer games with no story modes expressing arguments and ideas, it's really difficult to figure out how that actually happens, and the solution oftentimes ends up focusing on its players. Bonnie Nardi and T.L. Taylor both talk about its players, the players navigating multiplayer environments. And it's not good or bad, but that puts these sorts of games at a disadvantage compared to, like, say, single-player meaning-making games like Gone Home or Baba Is You or Nier Automata, Persona 4. But you might actually have, even if it's a little bit unfocused, even if it's a little bit percolative, a kind of structure that emerges in Arena specifically through its multiplayer that reflects back on its nature as a discussion about television. The game attempts to, in a lot of mechanical ways, capture the same combat feeling as Persona 4 while simultaneously demonstrating an awareness that one of its primary audiences are going to be people who won't generally be that into fighting games. It's extremely idiosyncratic from that perspective, but from an aesthetic one, it's actually quite faithful, but in a way that's quite different from Persona 4. At a glance, Arena doesn't seem like that much of a TV piece. It seems like it's just bandwagoning off of the Persona 4 televisual aesthetic, but hidden in its portrayal of televisual viewing is also a discussion about the history of television leading up to the Pokemon shock. See, The use of a K1 combat sport is fascinating when we think about the role that sort of entertainment has in Japan. There's some really straightforward examples. Navigators, for instance, are fairly rare in fighting games.
Navigators are great because it's one of the many things I think Persona 4 Arena does that reflects the RPG. But you pick your character, you can pick to have glasses on or off, nice little touch. If you don't play Persona, you're like, what's the point? But if you do play Persona, you go, that's cool. And then you can have a navigator on or off. And in the RPG, the navigator is like talking to you, right, all the time, like watch out, or there's this around the corner, or like I sense this. So in the fighting game, the navigator is like the in battle, like the navigator will talk to you while you're fighting. So it's like that. So like if you're getting beat up, they're like, oh, you gotta do something to turn it around. Basically, the only other fighting game I've seen that has this is Street Fighter 6, and you can turn on commentary settings.
So seeing them in Arena is interesting because they serve two purposes. For more experienced players, they create a specific kind of texture, a nice little encouraging thing that helps sell the feeling of the games, and they were navigators from Persona 4. For newer players, navigators can tell you pretty explicitly what the games want you to do.
So when you're doing well, the navigator's like, beat him up, like, yeah, go get him, right? When you're getting beat up, it's like, oh no, you gotta do something to turn it around, or we go watch out, or something, right? Or if you get hit by a certain type of thing. This was like, Persona was kind of the first fighting game that would tell the player why they're getting hit. Like they'll be like, oh no, you can't get thrown like this, or something like that. As time goes on, like more fighting games add things in the game to let the player know why they got hit, because that's for new people.
But most of what informs Persona 4 is actually something aesthetic and non-interactive. Most of how it presents TV tends to refer back to an imagination of television that's interlocked with a history of Japanese broadcasting. And it's because of its combat sport aesthetic. The tournament arc, the belt, the navigators. While Persona 4 presents different facets of entertainment interlocked with television, tokusatsu, gaming, game shows, healing content, Persona 4 focuses on sports entertainment. Now let's be clear here, sports entertainment isn't something alien to fighting games. Part of the premise of Virtua Fighter and Tekken are partly these witness combat engagement, and it still continues. Street Fighter 6 is heavily caked in mixed martial arts entertainment. And if you really want to stretch the definition, then most fighting games perform combat entertainment in some ways. Being able to play and replay material is the stepping stone for a specific kind of commentary that you see happen in a lot of competitive games.
Oh, I see what happened here. So he saw the startup.
But Arena is fascinating because it directly employs televisual watching as not only core to its mechanical language, but also its aesthetic language. And the site of Genesis is up front because combat sports were at the heart of post-war Japan. Though Japan is one of the largest cohesive broadcasting structures in the world today, it wasn't always that cohesive. One of the major things to note is that the explosion of personal Japanese television didn't occur until the 60s. Broadcasting began in the 50s, well, technically post-war, but in 1960, about 55% of households owned a TV set, while in 1964, that spiked up to 95%. Mark Steinberg, author of Anime's Media Mix, has talked about why this is. An upward trajectory that's been aided by the broadcasting of the Japanese royal wedding, as well as the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. Japan's post-war TV environment has an interesting relationship with its national identity. As the country emerged out of the war and politicians were trying to figure out how to cohere the country ideologically, television became an incredibly valuable tool. One of the things that's interesting about television is that it kind of comes before the content. You have to build the infrastructure to broadcast, and then you actually broadcast. But Japanese TV just didn't come out of nowhere. It learned its lessons from radio broadcasting, and then it played a somewhat antagonistic role against cinema. In fact, this is something famously claimed by Donald Ritchie, that television damaged the Japanese film industry much more than either the 1923 earthquake or the 1945 fire bombings, which, is very dramatic, but he's not entirely wrong. Everybody knows, for instance, Ishiro Honda, the director of the original Godzilla, but a lot of people probably don't know that Honda's most successful film was actually King Kong vs. Godzilla, which Honda levied as a sort of discussion of Japanese TV ratings by adopting the storytelling language of one of TV's biggest offerings, pro wrestling.
Somehow, Will Ospreay able to land that hook kick.
Television was a forceful, ubiquitous technology that simultaneously was kinda asymmetrical. And what I mean by this is that at the time, TV wasn't just something everyone had. Sets were initially expensive, and much TV access came through NHK, which came from subscriber fees. NHK at this time generally catered to a specific type, a sort of emerging bourgeois class that was commensurate with Japan's growing middle and upper middle class population, which is really important to know was really starting to get into the throngs of consumerism. And when I say TV learned from radio, it's because of NHK. NHK was a massive source of ambient cultural flattening and as a means to expand what was considered at the time a quote-unquote common culture. And these questions are still at play. Everybody probably knows about Makoto Shinkai's Kimi no Nawa, but fewer people probably know about the radio series of the same name that ran from 1952 to 1954, also known as Kimi no Nawa, which, let me know if this is familiar, about a man and a woman, and a chance encounter, and then the promise to meet again. Do a fast zoom in. So you kind of get an idea of where NHK was coming from. It was trying to cohere a specific kind of Japanese identity through the technology of broadcasting. Television essentially became the great tool that helped shape a specific imagination of post-war Japan. But then also came the Americans. The injection of specific kinds of entertainment media aren't necessarily just the decisions of private actors. When we talk about luridity, sex entertainment is a major subject. The explosion of Japanese media technology isn't something that can be honed down to a single factor. I'd more argue that if we look at the specific period in history on the basis of private broadcast intentions, there was a devoted battle between two visions of televisual watching that can shed light on why certain genres of media entertainment became sites of analysis. And sports entertainment comes up a lot in these discussions. On August 1953, Nippon Terebi, NTV for short, began offering a different style of televisual content. Instead of focusing on subscriber fees like NHK, NTV president Shoriki Matsutaro came up with a completely different strategy. Get as many people in front of TVs as possible and have advertisers pay for production and broadcasting. But how do you get TVs in front of people when most people at the time didn't have TVs? Well, you make it public. This is what we call Gaito Terebi, or street TVs, or plaza TVs, where people stood around public televisions and watched programming. Matsutaro called these live billboards, and given that the main reason as to why they were structured the way they were was to keep people there for the commercials. But to stay there, you kinda needed something that, one, you had a lot of, and two, was really eye-catching. Most of it was sporting events, sumo, boxing, and pro baseball, but the one that really worked really well was wrestling, pro wrestling, especially Riki Dozan, a Korean-born Japanese pro wrestler, also known as the father of Japanese pro wrestling. Though brief, the period of street TVs played a massive role in helping us think about early Japanese television. In November 1953, for example, while NHK showed about 20,000 television sets, NTV purportedly counted 23,000 watchers at Shimbashi Station, 9,000 at Jiyugaoka, and 10,000 at Kawaguchi. In the Riki Dozan Kimura vs. Sharp Brothers tag team, archives suggested an estimate of 900,000 people in Tokyo alone watched the championship series. In fact, Jason Makoto Chun probably hits at it the hardest. If we consider that Tokyo's population at the time was 8 million people, then an overall audience equal to roughly 1 in 9 people in the Tokyo area watched each pro wrestling broadcast. And when TV sets start to penetrate households en masse in the early 60s, these preferences don't go away. There's a sort of fascinating logic, therefore, that's presented in television through Persona that we can see mapped out and carried on to Arena. While Persona 4 touches upon questions of atmospheric elements of TV reminiscent of the Pokemon shock, it also reflects that time. Arena is kinda similar because regardless of how intentional it is, it captures similar sentiments of televisual history. While Persona's flirting with wrestling didn't start with Arena, Arena takes the spectator combat sport aesthetic to its most outspoken dimension, specifically how it defines everything around combat sports. So that's it, right? Persona 4 Arena might be capturing a specific imagination of televisual history. And this is all held on a thread thin as a thimble, and I'm just wasting your time, right? I mean, kinda, I guess, sure, maybe, I don't know. So far, I've only talked about Persona 4 Arena on its aesthetic terms. Questions of spectatorship, who to design for, and why that has to be the case. But one of the other components of Persona 4, especially with regards to television, is broadcasting. Not only what is being broadcasted, but how broadcasting acts as a plane that affects how the content is delivered. Calling competition content is a little bit strange, and Arena doesn't really have enough of a discussion on broadcasting in its story to really warrant examining on those grounds, but it does perform broadcasting in a few ways. One of the main elements of multiplayer is the inevitable metagame that emerges, and as players develop strategies to, get good. Everyone kind of knows that. Like, yeah, of course players are going to use resources on how to get good, but have you considered what that means on a theoretical level? Like, what kind of performances emerge when players attempt to save stuff for nationals?
Is this the same game? What happened from last night until
In
now?
other words, Arena discusses broadcasting just like Persona 4, but its discussion on broadcasting is enacted very differently, specifically because it's about learning metas. The nature of broadcasting wires and the static of the TV is replaced by a different set of wires and static, that of internet connections and arcade cabinets.
The main thing is the US community at the time, they did try to organize like online practice and try like share like tactics against the different characters and stuff.
I have a little bit of experience already from playing him before, and I know it's definitely helped me.
But in the end, like just being able to play often with somebody that's high level and then like talk, like being able to review the games.
This is really important. Playing to get good isn't just to sit in a cave and work out like a shonen protagonist, but it requires a devoted community willing and able to share information, to constantly test against each other, and ultimately lift up the quality of play of everyone around it. However, while that's an intuitive claim, the difficulties aren't the same. It's important to note that Japanese arcades in the process of playing there still dominated the high-level scene, especially in 2012. In comparison, the United States, due to its major geographic differences and its effectively dead arcade culture, had different strategies on how to get good. In other words, playing and learning how to play came with infrastructures, and strategies to learn ended up playing very differently across cultures. This is something you'll even see today. Gerald Lee examines, for instance, how infrastructural challenges affect Pakistan's arcade scene, and so it crafts a different kind of environment than East Asia.
So the biggest difference between playing in Japan and playing in the US at the time, outside of, well, specifically for Persona 4 Arena, that was a pretty important game for Arxis fighters in the US because the game came out on console extremely quickly. Because it came out in arcades, I want to say like April 2012, and it came out on Xbox, PS3 like July 2012. So usually back then we had to wait like a while. In the past, it would be like a year or more unless you imported the game and do various things. And because you had these, for lack of a better word, you're like gatekept out of playing people basically. Like the classic Japan dominating America is. The country is smaller and everyone's closer, so high-level people can practice for each other more often, and they get the games immediately. They get the versions that we want to compete in immediately, where we would get them 1 year, 15 months, and bad times, or like 9 months after them, so they're just like really, really advanced. In Persona's case, we got it really, really close.
There were so many naysayers that said that this would be a Japanese-only tournament. That is not the case.
But arcades also came with distinct technical challenges that invariably end up informing players even in competitive spheres, especially how they dealt with each other.
There's multiple types of arcade cabinets you could play Persona on. We used to decode it by colors, like blue Vuelix, red Vuelix, like stuff like that. And you the player do not have a choice of what it's on, right? So the delay in arcades tends to be higher than on consoles, especially with like optimized setups and stuff. So what I say basically is like the games are made for arcade. So whatever delay that is, like I'm not saying you have to play at that delay, obviously, but when you talk about the game balance and stuff, you can't talk about it from the perspective of like a home setup where you reduce delay settings, because when you're like, oh, this move sucks, like why would you use this move? This move sucks, it's so slow. You only think it's slow because you're playing on your home setup. If you're playing an arcade, you might get hit by that. The common example is like there's you can use like Bokuska, the universal overhead, right? The fastest ones in the game, I want to say, are 23 frames. So from a fighting game player's perspective, that is not that good of an attack, honestly. 23 is pretty slow for like a mix-up tool. But in arcades, arcade players would always be like, you can't block Chie and Narukami's overhead on reaction. Like they just die to it all the time.
Can't block those.
Because of the delay on the cabinet. I've asked the game devs this before, and they're like, they're basically like, yeah. Like, they make the game with the worst version that would be played in mind. So they don't make games, for example, for like the dude who has like a 4K PC with like the best monitor of all time. They make the game for like, oh, this dude Chris has an old laptop from 3 years ago, basically. And the speed of the attacks really matter. So when people are like, why is this move so slow, that are playing at home, I'm like, it's not that it's slow. They're not making it they're not thinking about this platform. They're thinking about here instead.
In other words, the games are developed for a specific imagined space in mind, and consequently, different experiences and metas emerge as the technology of the console and the arcade run up against each other. The experience, even in competitive play, which has been controlled and meted out, begins not at logging onto the network, going into story mode, or even the character selection, but at one of the things you can't even control that well: the machine. Your experience with the game, whether you think it feels good or bad, fair or cheap, starts before you even turn the game on. Funny enough, this is something you'll see mentioned in media theorists like Stuart Hall. Hall mentions that we tend to think of content as something that just gets sent to us, a message with a sender and a receiver. And in most instances, we act as if that's the case. Even discussions about media presume that relationship. This artist wants to express this message, and it's up to us to notice it. But Hall argues that that's not as clear. Messages go through layers of connective discursive practices. Hall was essentially trying to have his cake and eat it too. He was trying to reconcile how meaning-making operates if stages of circulation can semi-autonomously shape the content itself. We can see how that happens in Arena. The experience of the game doesn't begin at the game, this package, this disc that... Under Night? Where'd my game go? It begins at multiple points through the machine. The cabinet informs the meta. Its culture informs the information, and the information is informed by practices.
So, America, how about America?
Rest in peace, America.
And this is important because strategies on getting good inform the way in which we engage and digest messages in these games. But how it's possible to get good plays a role in informing the game itself. Like, the way in which we learn how to engage with opponents is upheld by a whole paratextual infrastructure that can be very distinct based on geography and subculture. And that translates directly into how we come to conclusions on media.
Everyone would use forums, or people were using Skype, so that was like another thing that you would use to like try to talk to people and stuff. So on the forums, there was just a thread of just like, getting ready for EVO 2015. These are the people we know who are coming from Japan. These are the characters they play. This is some footage of them playing. It's also, Japan doesn't record footage that often sometimes. So like, if you're talking about like the 2013 example, the real famous thing about the winner, Yume, is that like, he famously hated when people recorded his games. And he also would purposely not enter tournaments that he knew they would record, besides like qualifier, because for a qualifier you have no choice. Like if you're going to a tournament where the reason why you're going is to qualify for something else and they're recording it, well, it's like, it's too bad bro, like sorry. But besides that, he wouldn't do it. So there's barely, outside of him playing EVO and God's Garden, the God's Garden he won, there's basically no footage of this dude playing the game, and he's considered the best player ever to play that game. but you can't find any. It's hard. You can just find him beating my ass, basically. That's it. So when we were doing research for Ultimax, like some of the people, there was a ton of footage of them playing, but then some of the people were like, dude, like who is this guy? like who is this?
Performance I've ever seen for Persona, possibly even better than Yume's.
So it was kind of hard, but everything was organized on a forum, on Dustle forum.
Arena, while it might not, on a narrative level or on an aesthetic level, concern itself with television in the same way that Persona 4 did, is nevertheless focused on similar questions and concerns of infrastructure. Not in the way it expresses it, not in the way its narrative talks about it, but in the way it plays it. The story of Persona 4 Arena is ultimately a story about flow, a flow between space and time, a flow of subcultures, a flow between consoles and arcades forced to collide into this thing, this commodity that existed in a time where multiple actors and developers were trying to figure out how to set a specific kind of thing regarding their success, emblematized in a way to think about and rethink about design during a period where an entire genre demanded rethinking the content formula. In other words, it's just interesting. The experience of playing the game doesn't begin at loading up the game, but it begins at all of these sets of interactions in this way, extended beyond the game itself. The way in which the arcade is structured, the inputs, how you learn, who you talk to, who you interact with, become all of these factors that create a maelstrom. This video was meant to look at a specific subject that, for the most part, isn't really tackled that much: television. And I mean, yeah, there's talks about television in general, but televisual discussion in Persona 4 tends to be narrative or literal. Why does the Midnight Channel exist? What is the point of TV? But this video attempts, it doesn't succeed. I'm fully aware of that. It doesn't succeed. Because, you know, realistically, I'm not smart enough to figure this out. But it attempts to thread a variety of ideas through the lens of television, not just to uphold television as something that must be analyzed, unquestioned, but to open up different ideas and different perspectives on some of the things we generally don't think about too much. And there's reasons why. It's really challenging and kind of exhausting to think about the content delivered to us as something through us, as a piece of electric flow that doesn't stop circulation the moment we turn it off or stop playing, but constantly moves in motion, flickering through people like planes of glass. Everybody watching this video will be familiar with this image, mainly because I'm probably showing it a few times. And there's a lot of ways to read it. However, I think it makes a lot of sense as an infrastructural metaphor. A human body hanging upside down from telephone wires, a twisting and collision of vectors of energy and information, because that's what wires are carrying, that stop at, but don't end at, a brief sight of the human body. I think the difficult implication of that, however, is that this stuff doesn't end at you. Your experience of media might not necessarily end at you. It gets constantly recycled and reconfigured in different ways. Then even if you play it again, it might be changed and modified through technology that might not even stop for you. Even coming here to this video about Persona 4, Persona 4 Arena, and even if you learn a minute's worth of stuff within this, however long this video is going to be, it affects the way in which you kind of go into this text, or it affects the way in which you retroactively think about that text. And I don't mean that in a, wow, I'm thinking I'm changing your mind. Both Persona 4 and Arena are discussions about the same things. Flows of media, of static, flows of information, flows of people and images, because they're both about infrastructure. And at the heart of it, they both reflect this through similar subjects. A vision of television, a device that has generally, historically, been a machine that interprets flow.